Thank you for joining today. Let's give it 30 more seconds before we dive in. Alrighty, see a fair amount of participants streaming in. So hello and thank you everyone for joining us today. My name is Casper Spokas. I'm the director of the electricity program at Clean Air Task Force and your host and moderator for today. Today we're going to hear from Dr. John Parsons on his new report on the economic value of Diablo Canyon Power Plant. Then we're going to proceed to a fireside chat to discuss the study's findings and some broader implications. Last, we're going to leave some time to tackle audience Q&A. So please add your questions via the Q&A feature on Zoom, and we're going to be reviewing those as we go and answer some of your questions at the end. And then just note that this webinar will be recorded. So California, as we all know and probably appreciate, is pursuing one of the most ambitious clean energy transitions in the world with a statutory goal of achieving 100% clean electricity by 2045 under SB 100. At the same time, the state faces growing electricity demand, rising costs, and ongoing concerns about grid reliability. One important topic of conversation has been the role of existing nuclear plants in California. The Diablo Canyon Power Plant, located in San Luis Obispo County, is California's last remaining operational nuclear power plant. It has a capacity of roughly 2.2 gigawatts across two units and generates approximately 18 terawatt hours a year of non-emitting energy, roughly equivalent to 6 to 8% of California's total electricity consumption, depending on how much was consumed, and roughly 20% of California's non-hydro clean energy. The plant, if you've been keeping tabs, has had quite a dramatic history, which John will cover with regards to shutdowns and extensions. And now the plant is slated to cease operations in 2030, but has the potential for continued operations past that date. And so this begs the question, should California lawmakers enable Diablo Canyon to remain in operations past the current 2029 to 2030 shutdown date? So to inform this debate, a new report from MIT was recently published that evaluates the economic and system-wide implications of keeping California's last remaining power plant online through 2045. Luckily, we have the report's author with us today, John Parsons. Excuse me, John Parsons is the Deputy Director of Research at MIT Center for Energy and Environmental Policy Research and a senior lecturer at the MIT Sloan School of Management. His research focuses on the valuation and financing of investments in the energy industry, especially those needed to transition to a low carbon economy, and also on the problems of risk in energy and environmental markets. He was the co-director of the 2018 MIT study on the future of nuclear energy in a carbon-constrained world and a co-author of the 2021 Stanford MIT study on extending the life of the Diablo Canyon nuclear power plant. Dr. Parsons has served as an associate member of the U.S. Commodity Futures Trading Commission Energy and Environmental Markets Advisory Committee and has been a visiting scholar at the U.S. Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. John, thanks very much for being here. We'll pass it over to you.
Thanks very much, Karparas. Appreciate that. Let me put my slides up on the screen. All right, we can see that, Karparas?
Yes, we can see that.
Great. All right, so as Karparas said, Diablo Canyon has had a rich history. So let me just frame the question for discussing continued operation. So Diablo's original licenses extended to November 2024 and August 2025. And there were negotiations in advance leading up to those dates between the owner, PG&E, a number of public organizations, and eventually the California Public Utility Commission, and a decision was made to shut down the plant at that date. However, in 2022, the legislature with SB 846 extended operation for 5 years. to October 2029 and October 2030. Diablo has 2 units, so one unit was extended to October 2029 and the other to October 2030. Now, when the Nuclear Regulatory Commission relicenses nuclear power plants, typically they relicense them for 20 years. And in fact, they did do that for Diablo Canyon. So its license is extended to November 2044 and August 2045. But in order to continue operating for those last 15 years, it needs continued authorization from the state to allow that. So the question on hand is whether California should extend operations for the final 15 years of this extended license from 2029, 2030 to 2044, 2045. So that's what we're talking about. And I'm an economist, so I'm going to focus on the economic costs and benefits. But of course, that's just one aspect of a larger issue. But that's what I'm going to focus on. That's what I think I can help inform the conversation about. All right, so just quickly to summarize the results right here at the top. This chart shows 3 bars. The 2 left bars are 2 different scenarios, assuming Diablo Canyon is retired at the end of at this 2029-2030 window. The right-hand bar shows you something that happens if we extend the life of Diablo to 2045. The vertical axis here is the present value of costs. And this is about the entire electricity generating system. What are the costs of the investments in generation and the costs expended in operating the generation and so on? I'll detail that more in a moment. But what you can see on this chart, looking at the middle bar, which is called the least cost case, but still with Diablo Canyon retired, if you move from the middle bar to the right-hand one, extending the life of Diablo Canyon, you lower the cost of the system by $7.6 billion, about $500 million a year in that extended 15 years of life. Now, how we do this calculation depends a lot on what we assume will be done if Diablo Canyon is retired. And the far left bar, which is called a base case, is predicated on other assumptions about what investments are made in the grid and generation. And you can see there that by shifting from retiring Diablo Canyon under that set of assumptions, you would say by extending the life, you would save 20 billion. So there's a large range there, and I'll get into the details about what distinguishes the 2 cases, the 2 ends of that range. All right, so what we did is we used something called capacity expansion modeling. This is sort of the standard tool which people like us use to analyze extending the life of to analyze all sorts of questions about investments on the grid. And the California Public Utility Commission also is using this kind of a tool. So you input to this modeling different forecasts of load. So how much is California's grid going to require more electricity through 2045? But you also have to look at the variation in load through the year. Summer peaks, how big are those peaks going to be, and so on. Then you put in a set of technology options. What kind of generators might we invest in? What kinds of storage might we invest in? What investments in transmission could we make? You have to look at, when you're talking about solar and wind, you have to make forecasts about how much solar generation you can get in the different months of the year and what quality of wind you have in different locations in California. And then you input other constraints. California wants to make sure that it has reliability on the grid at all times of the year. So there's a little bit of a margin put in there. We need to have capacity in case of other capacity goes offline or in case of extreme load events and so on. And of course, as Karparas said, California has some very ambitious decarbonization targets. So you put those into the model. and then you do the mathematics of the model, and you choose a portfolio of investments to minimize the total capital and operating costs that Californians have to pay in order to get sufficient load in all of the years, in all of the hours, and so on. Now, here at MIT, one of a favorite in-house model for doing this is called GenX, but different places have different versions of the model. The study, which Karparas mentioned that I had helped work on with colleagues at Stanford and MIT, is shown here in the picture from 2022. Chapter 1 of that study did a similar capacity expansion modeling, but used something called the ERBS model. For this report, I've gone and looked at modeling that the California Public Utility Commission commissioned. It's called, the model they used is Resolve. And this Resolve model is vended to them by a consulting firm, E3. Now, the reason for using this model is there are a couple things. First of all, it's extremely detailed for the California system. It has already embedded in it all sorts of information about existing resources, the transmission grid, and out-of-state resources as well. Then jumping down to the bullets on inputs, the California Public Utilities Commission runs a very transparent process in which they develop what should be the inputs to the models. So they discuss the costs of different types of generation in the future. They discuss where are wind and solar and geothermal resources available to California. And they discuss what kind of new technologies, like better geothermal, are coming down the pike, and do we want included in the model? And so I think it's really good to take advantage of a model that is both nicely detailed for California, and that already the California process, the public deliberations, develops the inputs so that we're talking together about the same numbers, so that our answers here on Diablo Canyon fit together with other answers being developed for California. Now, in order for this to be useful, though, it has to be useful for the question at hand, which is Diablo Canyon. But fortunately, in October 2025, the California Public Utility Commission published some results of the model specifically assessing the impact of continued operation of Diablo Canyon. And so what I'm doing is making use of this publication of runs of that model, and I'm going in and extracting the results that tell us something about Diablo Canyon. And so what I put on this slide is the 3 very large files, sort of big data dumps of results of applying that model to 3 scenarios. So all of the numbers that I present to you today are numbers that appear on the California Public Utility Commission website, utilizing this Resolve model with the inputs that are already being done in California. All right, so let me give you a little bit more detail about these 3 scenarios so you can understand what we're doing. So first of all, before diving into any one scenario, just the principle of how each scenario is constructed. California already has a bunch of generation on the system. So you've got a baseline of existing assets, and also California has already begun investing in other assets or planning investments in other assets. So you've got this baseline of existing and planned assets. Those are locked in across all scenarios. Then, for each scenario, you make some specific assumptions about some other investments. You'll see them. And then after that's been done, the last thing is you use the model to optimize, to pick the remaining assets that you will invest in order to have enough generation to meet the load, in order to meet the decarbonization targets, and in order to have the planning margin to guarantee reliability. Now I can dive into something about each of the 3 scenarios. So first of all, we have that scenario that's called least cost. First, about the least cost, it assumes Diablo Canyon is closed. That was a mandate in the legislation that they have to assume it's closed. And then it just figures out, let's optimize the system in light of that fact. The base case scenario also assumes Diablo is closed, but it makes some specific assumptions about additional investments related to legislation AB 1373. As we'll see coming down the line, most of those additional investments are offshore wind, as well as some very long duration storage. And then it optimizes. And then finally, we have the Diablo Canyon scenario. In this scenario, it's assumed that we will keep Diablo Canyon open to 2045, but we optimize everything else. So what I'm going to do is compare and contrast the results of the third scenario against the other two. Let me say something about these scenarios. All three of these scenarios provide enough electricity capacity and generation to meet the load. All three of these have enough capacity to satisfy reliability margins. All three of these achieve the decarbonization targets. They only differ by cost. And so what I'm going to do is unpack the difference in cost. Now, before I go straight to the differences, I want to say something to put this conversation in context. A lot of times in something like this, we're talking about different technologies, and people have champions for which technology they think should be what gives us decarbonization. And sometimes that conversation gets distorted and doesn't have right proportions about what's going on. So in the scenario where we keep Diablo Canyon, I want to make the point that all scenarios require massive investments in renewables. So what I'm showing you in this picture here is we're going through the years of the forecast 2026 out to 2045. And what you see on the vertical axis is the generation in each year, terawatt hours of electricity. And each of those colored bars are different technologies. So the gold colored bar is solar, for example. The three different blue colored bars are different types of wind. The bright red and the darker red are two types of geothermal. There's a beige bar at the bottom. That's nuclear, both Diablo Canyon and the portion of the Palo Verde plant that is imported to deliver to Southern California. So you can see here, if you look out to 2045, even with Diablo Canyon open, renewables account for 95% of all generation. Solar accounts for 50% of all generation. Diablo Canyon only accounts for less than 4% of generation. So when we talk about keeping Diablo Canyon open, we're talking about a system which nevertheless has a massive investment in renewables. And if you compare going from 2026 to 2045, you can see the enormous challenge that California is undertaking is being solved primarily by investments in things like solar and wind. On the far left, in 2026, the darker orange, the regular solar, not customer solar, is 67 terawatt hours. By 2045, it's 207 terawatt hours. So it's grown by 140. That is, you've added more than 200% over that window in order to achieve this decarbonization. So I just think that's important to keep in perspective. We're not putting nuclear in competition with solar here. Everything is needed. And in fact, a massive investment in renewables is needed in all cases that we're talking about here. All right, with that context, let me go to the main result. So here we're going to compare the keep Diablo Canyon scenario against the closed Diablo Canyon, but optimize everything else. So the least cost without Diablo Canyon. And what we're showing here is capacity, megawatts of each different type of facility. So once again, on the horizontal axis, going from 2026 to 2045. On the vertical axis, those are gigawatts of capacity. And everything is mostly negative because what we're saying is if you put Diablo Canyon back into the system, what does it replace? What does it supplant? What do you take out? Or if you take Diablo Canyon out, these negatives are what is needed to replace it. So take the bottom bar, the gray bar. That's natural gas. So there's 1.3 gigawatts of natural gas capacity. It's already existing natural gas, but if you keep Diablo Canyon open, you can displace that gas out of this system that we're analyzing here. The gold is solar, so you can delay a lot of your solar investments. And solar is being built on this system very quickly, and it's very challenging to build it. And you sort of buy breathing room for that solar build out. And the purple is storage, which goes along with the solar build out. So in that last bar, 2045, you've delayed 5.5 gigawatts of solar investment and 2.9 gigawatts of storage. On top, not shown in this diagram, are some transmission investments. So about 1.64 gigawatts of transmission upgrades that you don't need to make. So by avoiding those investments, that's what's shown in that chart I showed you right at the beginning. The least cost is the middle bar. The Diablo Canyon scenario, keeping it continued operating, is the right-hand bar. A savings of $7.647 billion is savings from that capacity that you don't have to build. And that's the major input to that number. So I think that's the most important thing that I wanted to show you. I want to close up here quickly and get to questions. I haven't talked about that base case. I'll talk about it briefly now. So I'm putting two charts on the screen here. The far left one is the one I showed you a moment ago, the least cost. The far right one is the base case. It's basically the same idea. By keeping Diablo Canyon operating, you displace some investments. But in the base case, there are investments in offshore wind which are very expensive. And they become one of the two things that you displace differently from the least cost. There's also this dark blue bar in the diagram, which does not appear in the least cost. And that's some very long duration storage, which is a new and expensive technology. And so because the base case has these very expensive technologies in it, that's why keeping Diablo Canyon open, if that's your counterfactual, you save so much more money. All right, and then to really close out. So just to mention, the report goes into detail on things like present value calculations, modeled and interpolated years, just the mechanics. It goes more into the base case in the AB 1373 investments. And there's a section talking about the Diablo Canyon costs themselves, proofing those costs against what I could find in the data. So let me stop there and we can have our conversation and answer questions.
Well, thank you very much, John, for your report and your presentation. Just a reminder before we jump into the fireside chat for the audience, you may enter questions that John and I will review and answer at the end of this webinar. So please add them through the Q&A function in this Zoom. Usually the Q&A function can be found at the bottom of the Zoom window where you can enter questions that we will monitor. And we'll get to those in roughly 10 to 15 minutes. Um, so John, thanks again for your report and your presentation. I guess, you know, just starting off, what led you to take a closer look at Diablo Canyon's future? Why was this the right moment from your perspective to revisit the question and extending the plant's operating life and the economic implications of that?
Well, just as a little bit of background, I've been doing research on nuclear power for a couple decades. And one of the things that I've been focused on in the US, but also elsewhere, is life extensions of nuclear power plants. So, what are the economics of life extensions and such? Um, but then, as 2024 was approaching and Diablo might get closed, a colleague approached me and asked me to join the study, which eventually became that Stanford MIT study, because you've got this big asset here, a terribly valuable piece of industrial equipment, so vital to providing low carbon electricity. It just seems a no-brainer that that ought to stay open. And so we were really looking for how can we, there were a lot of people whose minds were closed, but is there a way to get the conversation going again? And we did that study. And then as well, there were the problems in California with transmission lines and potential summer outages, which really changed the whole conversation and hence a 5-year extension. But we're coming close to the end of the 5 years. And I think the same question is in front of California. Do you want to dispose of this valuable asset or can it be useful? And whether it really is valuable or not is an economic question. And there are other non-economic questions, but I've been involved in it, so I thought it was worthwhile to dig into it and keep providing useful information.
Great. Thanks. Um, Thanks from all of us for that. So, you know, in a lot of these discussions and debates, um, some people say that nuclear is quite expensive, and especially from a levelized cost of electricity. But your report shows that Diablo can be quite valuable. And correct me if I'm wrong, those system savings already include, right, the cost, an estimated cost of operating the plant going forward. So, can you help us better understand how we should think about the cost and value of nuclear generally, especially when you're considering, what type of value it brings in the cost savings and offsetting different types of resources that are necessary to achieve decarbonization?
Sure. When we talk about nuclear, we really need to be careful and not tag it as if there's just one nuclear. There are many nuclears. The context is really important. It is true that there have been efforts to build new nuclear plants in the US and in a few other countries that have proven to be extremely expensive. And I would be in the team that would be pointing that out and asking people to, take that to heart. But at the same time, what we're talking about here is a very different beast. We've already built Diablo Canyon. It is functioning. And so we shouldn't expect the answer to be necessarily the same thing. So we spent a lot of money to build it. It's an asset that we already have. The economic question is likely to be different in that case.
Thanks. And one finding that I think stood out, um, in the context of California that you were showing is just the amount of infrastructure that, one, needs to be built, but also that Diablo Canyon can reduce. Can you explain why nuclear and generally this firm, clean resource can have such a large impact on the overall build out, in comparison to some other technologies?
Well, I mean, it's a it's a type of power plant which, when you turn it on, operates very consistently. So has capacity factors roughly 90% of the hours of the year, it will be generating its electricity. So for every 1 megawatt of capacity you put in, you get a certain amount of electricity out. To replace that with, or what that can replace, some other kinds of assets, for example, a solar farm is going to be producing electricity roughly less than 30% of the hours of the year. And so you need more capacity to produce the same electricity. The capacity might be cheaper, so I'm not saying that it's thereby somehow that answers the question, but they're different assets. And you have to appreciate that a nuclear power plant produces an enormous amount of power on a small footprint in the land, and it produces that power throughout the year. Hence, you're going to be comparing it when you shift to other technologies to a very different profile, both of land use and of how many hours you get out of it.
Thanks. So I'm going to start including some Q&A questions now. Um, I see a question about power flow and reliability, um, saying, Resolve addresses some of these concerns about power flow and reliability, but as an analyst, there are risks in the real world that a closure of Diablo could put the grid into configurations where conventional power flow models underestimate or overestimate the difficulty of assuring reliability. So I think this question is getting to, Resolve is one type of model that can provide an assessment of potential replacement needs and the system costs. But there are additional, perhaps more granular power flow and reliability questions here at play as well. So can you comment a little bit on, one, the role of Diablo, but also just some of these more nuanced considerations when evaluating whether to retire or extend a power plant?
Sure. The California Public Utility Commission is not just using the Resolve model. It has a suite of models. And the questioner is certainly right. When you're looking at a power grid, there's complicated physics about how electricity flows in order to properly answer questions about the various assets and how reliable is the grid. You need to have a model that is informed about all those complications. But if you can't use a model that's informed about all those complications to answer other questions because it becomes too difficult. So you have what my old teacher used to call horses for courses. Different models do different things better or worse. And we use the Resolve model for this particular question, but the CPUC and others are using other modeling to analyze fully the reliability of grid and issues.
Sure. Question here as well about do you think that the lifetime extensions make more sense now than before because of incoming large loads?
Sure. You look across the country, there are several places where companies had closed nuclear power plants, but have recently decided, oh my goodness, that's a great option for meeting the future load and the need to decarbonize and so on. So Michigan is the first which did that with the Palisades nuclear power plant. It had already, in fact, been closed. And then the state decided, geez, we need more power. That's an option we should look at. And they succeeded in convincing the company to turn that plan around and come up with a plan to reopen Palisades. The same thing has happened in Pennsylvania with the Crane New Energy Center, or whatever they're calling that. That plant had already been closed, but now they decided that it was a valuable asset and could be reopened. Duane Arnold in Iowa is the same thing. So we're having a public discussion in the United States about increasing demand for electricity, some of it coming from data centers, some of it coming from things like electrification. And people right at the moment are not able to put new capacity onto the system as fast as they think they need it. And I think that's very instructive now to then look back at California and say, geez, are we the only ones who should be closing things down? Or maybe we should be thinking about this also. If you look at the diagram I showed about generation going out to 2045, California's going to double its use of electricity. It's an odd time to be closing something when what you also need to do is be installing new assets. And it's an even odder time to be closing something that's already low carbon to install new assets.
Thanks. And I think that addresses, we had a few questions come in about the relevance of this study and this potential decision for other regions. So I think you got at that question there. We have two clarifying questions about the report. One is, does the report assume new transmission build outs? And the second one is around the when new solar and solar plus storage plants are built out, which this report shows that Diablo would reduce the amount that is necessary by 2045, or at least shifts it out until after 2045. Um, these are very low marginal cost resources, and so they compete in CAISO's market by delivering energy below the market price. How does nuclear play into that type of pricing, market pricing regime? The question is around, how can these savings be realized, in a competitive market in California?
All right. So that's two questions. Okay, so
One
the
of,
first one,
Mhm.
the resolve model and transmission. In the resolve model, you are looking to figure out all of your different investments. So what new generation assets do I need to build? What new storage assets do I need to build? And what transmission investments do I need to add on? So in the modeling that I'm looking at, there are transmission upgrades in this, that, or the other location, depending upon which generation you choose to build. And so a part of the savings that I calculated, or that the resolve model had already calculated, what I'm pointing out is some of that savings is avoiding new transmission upgrades. So it is included in the process, the resolve modeling process. So that's one question. Then the other question about the solar. Um, Let me first say, once again, it delays some solar investments, but you need to do a massive solar investment. And what you want to think about it as, the first solar investment is easy. The second solar investment is not as easy, but also easy. But given the volume of solar that we're doing, that last solar investment, that can get to be hard. And it's only that last solar investment that we postpone a little and we get the benefit of the savings. So you give the solar developers some breathing room, but they're still working hard. So that's one point. But now, what was the question exactly? I've forgotten.
There's a question about how the savings would be realized in the
Uh,
market. And I think this relates to, merchant versus IRP related, decision making of, at what point are costs actually being deferred by planners and how does that get realized in the California system?
sure. I'm thinking this also has to do with curtailment. If you have an enormous solar on the system and you've got this nuclear on the system, there might be some hours when you have more capacity than you need. In this run of the resolve model, it's assumed that the nuclear plant is running full out except for the weeks that it's needed to take offline to be refueled. So it does not ramp up and down in response to solar. On the other hand, there is curtailment of renewables in some hours. You could change that. That was an assumption that the people who did this modeling put into it. Both in the Stanford MIT study from 2022 and in this report that I issued, we point out that nuclear power plants can be more flexible. It takes work to make them flexible. It's more complicated how you run them, but they can be made more flexible. You could have the nuclear be ramped down in certain hours when there's plentiful renewables. People fight about that, and one of my colleagues, economics colleagues, pointed out to me that the savings are not going to be very significant. But it's not hard to have a grid which has both sets of assets functioning. They work perfectly well alongside each other. The savings I'm reporting are based on one assumption about how you work them well together. You could get slightly higher savings by doing another assumption.
Thanks. We also have some questions about any major risk or nuclear plants, especially in California, need to account for waste and also reinforcing the plant against seismic damage. There was a question of whether those costs are being considered in the model.
Sure. So let me take first waste. It's more straightforward. So right at the moment, the waste that's being produced by the Diablo Canyon plant goes into what's called dry cask storage. You can actually see the dry cask storage. There's a sort of a field or a court where these dry casks are placed, not far from the main plant that's producing the power. That's been going on for a couple decades now. Those are very safe and secure, and those costs are included. They don't really amount significantly to anything here. So waste costs are included. I think it's exciting as a researcher in this field. It's been very frustrating sometimes to watch the US not be able to move forward with all of the aspects of a full solution to its waste issues. But now I look around and I see other countries for the first time have begun producing their repositories. So Finland is the first champion to do that, and we'll look to others. So I'm very heartened to see that be done. Now, on the seismic risk, California, the main regulator on this is, of course, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, and they have evaluated the seismic risks. And the Diablo Canyon power plant has been outfitted, so to speak, to be able to manage seismic risks. And California has been diligently monitoring that also. So I think the expenditures we're talking about here are already incorporating what is required to maintain and operate a safe facility.
Right. Thanks, John. Um, well, we are coming up on time. We had scheduled 45 minutes for this. And so, John, any last messages or words on the report?
No, thanks very much, Kasper, for helping out with having this webinar. I hope it's useful. I think it would be such a shame to see an asset that's so valuable to a challenge that the society faces of needing a lot of electricity, but needing it to be affordable and needing it to be low carbon. That's a tough challenge, and I hope we think carefully about how to manage that, and I'm hopeful that this is useful to that conversation.
Great. Well, thank you very much for contributing to the conversation. And thank you very much also for participating here. If people continue to have questions, feel free to reach out to us separately. We will try to answer them as best as we can. But thank you, everyone, for your time, and have a good afternoon.